If you've been comparing a handful of pre-built rigs, staring at the spec sheets, and still wondering which one actually makes sense for your gaming setup, this review should clear that up. I've spent the last week plugging the Skytech Azure 3 into a 144Hz monitor, swapping a few games in and out, and watching how it behaves when the room temperature climbs. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the big question most buyers have: will this machine handle my current library and future releases without me having to upgrade again in a year? The Azure 3 pairs an AMD Ryzen 79700X with an RTX 5060, 16 GB of DDR5 at 6000 MHz, and a full terabyte NVMe SSD. On paper, that looks like a sweet spot for 1080p 1440p gaming, and in practice it delivers just that. I ran Cyberpunk 2077 on high settings, and the frame rates hovered around 7080 frames per second, dipping only when the ray tracing toggle was cranked up. For titles that are more CPU-heavy, like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the Ryzen 7 kept the experience smooth, rarely dropping below 55 frames per second even in dense city sections. One of the practical strengths that shows up in day-to-day use is the AIO liquid cooler. It's a 360mm unit with ARGB lighting that isn't just for looks. The radiator stayed under 45°C during those longer sessions, and I didn't hear the fan ramp up to an obnoxious whine. That matters if you're gaming in a small apartment and don't want the whole room humming like a server farm. The 850W gold-rated PSU also gives a nice safety margin. You won't be worrying about the system tripping the breaker when you push the RTX 5060 with DLSS off. However, the value proposition isn't just about raw numbers. The inclusion of Wi-Fi C means you can go wireless out of the box, which is handy if your desk is tucked against a wall and running an Ethernet cable would be a pain. The system ships with a clean Windows 11 install and, notably, no bloatware. That saves you the annoyance of fighting pre-installed trial software that can slow boot times or clutter the start menu. The SSD's 1TB capacity feels generous for most gamers who keep a mix of AAA titles and indie games. And the NVMe interface means load times are practically instantaneous. World of Warcraft loaded in under 10 seconds from start to character select. Now let's talk about who should actually consider buying this. If you're a player who spends most of your time at 1080p or 1440p, enjoy a mix of fast-paced shooters and open-world RPGs, and want a machine that will stay relevant for at least the next 2 to 3 years, the Azure 3 fits nicely. It's also a solid choice for content creators who dabble in video editing or streaming. The RTX 5060's encoder handles a 1080p stream at 60 frames per second without taxing the CPU, and the 16 GB of DDR5 gives enough headroom for light multitasking. On the flip side, if you're chasing 4K ultra-high settings or you're planning to dive deep into ray tracing with maxed-out textures, the RTX 5060 will start to feel a bit constrained. You won't see the same performance headroom as a card from the RTX 40 series, so you'll end up turning down settings or accepting lower frame rates. Likewise, power users who routinely run multiple virtual machines, heavy rendering workloads, or want more than 16 GB of RAM out of the box may find the stock configuration limiting. Upgrading the RAM later is possible, but adds to the overall cost. Finally, anyone who already has a solid gaming monitor with G-Sync or FreeSync may notice that the HDMI output on the Azure 3 is limited to one display, so you'll need to use the DisplayPort for a dual monitor setup, which can be a minor inconvenience. There are a couple of hidden trade-offs worth mentioning. The case is a mid-tower with a tempered glass side panel, which looks great, but the front intake is a bit narrow. In hotter climates or during marathon gaming sessions, you might notice the internal temperatures creeping up a few degrees compared to a case with a larger front mesh. It's not a deal breaker, but it's something to keep in mind if you live in a warm apartment. Also, the system's cable management, while decent for a pre-built, isn't as tidy as a custom build. You'll see a few extra zip ties and some leftover cable length. That's typical for many ready-made rigs, but if you're a perfectionist who likes a pristine interior for easy upgrades, it could be a small annoyance. Another practical point, the RTX 5060 is listed as brand may vary. In my unit, it was a reference model from a reputable partner, and it performed consistently. However, the exact brand could affect cooling efficiency or clock speeds marginally. If you're sensitive to those variations, you might want to verify the specific GPU brand before finalizing the purchase, especially if you're hoping to squeeze every last frame out of demanding titles. Overall, the Skytech Azure 3 feels like a well-balanced package for its price tier. The combination of a high-end Ryzen CPU, DDR5 memory, and a solid AIO cooler means you won't be fighting thermal throttling, and